Hello and welcome to H697. It's little after 3 o'clock and the sun is actually coming down already. It is November in Sweden, but I do have some good news in this glowing darkness. The proposed idea that action is the complementary factor of both mind and matter, and where the paradox maybe not dissolve but becomes complementary and we become whole, actually has a theory. And this is good news from two different aspects. For the first, we get a tool to describe this. So in the process of understanding this proposed idea, we need a tool, and this could be the tool even if we discard it later. But there is no possibility to get anywhere without having a tool. It's a ready-made tool, just there for us to use. The second is extensive literature has actually been written on the thing. And we touched it barely at some instance, I think, about 200 lectures ago. And this goes to show, and makes me very happy, that we are sort of zooming in, or we are getting into the right ballpark, so to speak. Just the thing that we touched it before means that we are on the same path. It's not going all over the place. There is a direction to it, even if the direction is implicit, which it should be actually. Well, let me go into the subject after this applauding of the idea of the ideomotor action. And the one applauded is William James, the first psychologist. He is a marvelous philosopher in many ways. One thing that attracts a lot of people is that he's very far from analytical philosophy. He's extraordinarily pragmatic. This is the true philosophy of the United States, I always thought, where pragmatism goes way beforehand how anything is formulated or what words should be used or what they mean define. Here we have action. And ideomotor action is so weird, so one is surprised one haven't heard about it before. And I didn't know the details of the weirdness. But listen here. First, you perform an action, and then you have a thought. Can you see how this goes hand in hand with the Pfeiffer idea of movement, learning movement, and knowledge is in the movement? Thought is movement. You move and then you get a thought. So you can see also this is action derived. And this goes completely in the face of all known theories because they are based on objects. Or at least that objects has a central part in hierarchy. Where the objects come first and then possibly we have something else coming second. Here we have a more democratic status of the whole thing, and actually we do not need to prioritize here to say one is before the other. But let me go into the details here. So this is an excerpt from the book The Undivided Self, a very fitting title because it acts on basically the same premises we've been laying out the last couple of lectures. It's written by Theodore Diamond Jr. It is extensively hard to understand. I had it in my bookshelf years. I've read it. Well, I have to be honest, I never understood it. But isn't it a good thing I had it in my bookshelf anyway? So he writes like over this with idea, motor, action. And sorry, I read from the book because I can't make an excerpt and a resume because I had to grip this as well. So normally we think everything starts with an idea, but triggered actions are not blind reactions or an involuntary response to being moved. It's not the fact that it's involuntary. When you move, you get the thought. If an action is response to mental association, and if mental associations normally trigger voluntary actions, then we know that we appear to be an involuntary response is in fact based on the same patterns of activity as voluntary action. And so it's not involuntary at all. You could say what he's pointing to is somewhat what we mentioned before about the reflective consciousness, which in some aspect is not reflective and is not the consciousness and is not even a thing, I would say, because it doesn't have a definition. It's constantly different. It doesn't have a purpose. It has traits that makes you believe it's a thing that's very hard to define. So in the last section we went out to identify mental components in physical action. Our initial difficulty led us to discover a tension pattern that interfered with our innate physical muscular mechanism. This explained at the physical level the cause of muscular tension and strain. The next step was to understand what caused the tension pattern. By attempting to prevent this tension in activity, we saw that it was elicited at the subconscious level by the idea of performing actions. The moment we uncover larger behavioral pattern in which muscular activity is triggered subconsciously, however, we have a number of new problems to explain. It is well known that there are subtle connections between mind and body. In this sense, we can understand that muscles, movements, gestures would be susceptible to ideas and attitude. This does not, however, explain the function of such a connection or make sense of its structure. Why should it be the case that muscular activity is susceptible to associative processes? Why do these ideas operate and why are they communicated subconsciously? what is the relationship between the unwanted actions we have observed and conscious voluntary activity. This will be the subject of this and following chapters. It is common in the mind-body field to speak of practices that give relief for various ailments. Usually these practices describe methods for relaxing the mind, enhancing immune function, and the like. But because these methods are focused on producing immediate effects, they do not place the symptoms in a larger context, and so fail to articulate exactly what the problem is. The problem of muscular tension, however, falls squarely within the field of psychology. The psychology of how action takes place, and this is a crucial aspect of the problem that must be understood and described before we try to outline solutions or practices for dealing with the problem. We're talking about the person here in an example named Richard, and he performed an action, and the pattern of tension that he shows up in his body is linked to ideas and could be triggered by them. At first it appeared that when Richard moved, he could decide how the movement could take place and could therefore prevent the harmful tensions that accompanied the movement. But this was not in fact he was not in fact able to deliberately control his own action, because these actions were the result of mental associations that trigger the actions at the subconscious level. This role of associations in action represents a critical element in Richard's problems. Up to the point we have found that muscular tension is triggered by ideas that occur at the subconscious level. Because tension is physical in nature, the physical side of the problem was naturally the aspect which concerned us. So we took an interest in the mental dimension of the problem only so far as it is related to the triggering of the physical tension. What was not clear, however, was why the muscles and ideas were linked until we observed their underlying role in virtually all of Richard's actions. Normally we think the mind is in some way in command of the body. In this sense we make a separation between mind and body. But the real nature of ideas and muscles is that they are linked in our voluntary behavior. And this explains the true nature of actions and how they take place. Consider, for instance, what happens when you take a pen in your hand and begin to write. The decision to write is made, but it's not separate from the response of the body. The idea and the act form a seamless whole. This is in fact how all voluntary actions takes place. An idea, in Richard's case, the idea to speak, to lift his arm, or to stand, produces a motor effect, the two elements occurring as one event. These ideas, as we saw, operate mostly subconsciously, that is, automatically and unthinkingly. But the main point is that actions issues from thought, and the two being, for all intents and purposes, continuous. Both elements are part of a physical and mental mechanism that is designed to work this way. When we asked Richard to speak without gasping, he hesitated at first, trying not to take a breath in preparation to speak. But when he subconsciously thought of speaking, he gasped in preparation to speak in spite of his intentions, because the idea of speaking triggered the motor activity. This explains why ideas connect with muscular activity and what the function of this connection is. When we perform an action, we have the subjective sense that we somehow told our body what to do, that our mind, our ego, is in charge of the body. In this sense, we make a distinct separation between mind and the body. We make a distinct separation in two things that are not really separated. In fact, there is no such separation, and the feeling that there is one belies the reality how we actually perform voluntary actions. You are sitting, reading a book, and then decide to go to the kitchen to get something to drink. However, the decision to get up is not so much a conscious process as an associative flow of ideas into action. We feel afterwards that we did the action. We have a sense that we commanded the act, that we controlled it, but the action was largely a mechanical process in which mental events led to a physical or motor act at the subconscious level of which we are almost entirely unaware. I'm going to make 2 points here and continue for a little bit. Well, we talked earlier about the reflective consciousness, and the reflective consciousness is not something in reality. And this is what Libet showed with his experiment. We decide before the reflective consciousness, or whatever that is, has a hearsay. This shows that the controlling factor is not this invention, the reflective consciousness. It's a purely Western gestalt. It takes as its format objects in space in front of a subject. That's not very clear what it does, but something is controlling. And there is an I, and that I is connected between body and mind. Isn't that interesting? So underneath this reflective consciousness is a proper I, an ego. And the reflective consciousness is connected to classical physics. It shares the same confusion. The proper I is something that can be reached, I think, when we leave the ideas of the objects, when we use verb, when we understand that action underlies everything, then we can get closer to this I, our soul, our spirit. And this is the only thing that can control anything. Reflective consciousness cannot control everything. So this decoy which we live in or try to act out like a child's toy that doesn't really work anymore, that is the connection with classical physics, where quantum physics obviously is something that not confuses ex posteriori and ex anteriori like the reflective consciousness. Because the reflective consciousness one can measure. Go to Libet, I recommend see the YouTube clip about him, there are several, is after the action, ex posteriori. And that is the defining reason why classical physics exists. It has a clear connection to our mindset, our focal setting, or a misfiring of timed movements where we make a leap somewhere and we think that we can do something before when it can only be done afterwards, and vice versa. You see, it's a sort of fault. It's a complicated and different fault, but it still is a fault. The reflective consciousness is this fault. That's why it's not a thing. For those who think the real I is like the words that the reflective consciousness makes up of what they think could be the real I, when reflective consciousness actually ponder those things. The reflective consciousness could say it's intuition, or it's the spirit, or it's the archetype. No, nothing of that. It's proper. It's thinking in the normal sense, rational in the normal sense. It's just put together with more aspects of us, where the reflective consciousness, it's limits. It's made up of limits, and those limits are handmade, so to speak. So they don't really fit. It's a sort of device that somebody would paste on a big machinery and think it serves a purpose, but all of a sudden you see it's not connected. It doesn't have any wiring to the actual machine. I mean, that's an extraordinary good description of what the reflective consciousness is. It does have some effects, dampening effects. So it sucks up energy from the engine. That is true. And it's costly. Yes, it is. But in the actual machinery, it doesn't have a purpose. It doesn't help with the production, so to speak. And described from William James's ideomotor action, then the reflective consciousness would be a faulty way of moving about, moving tensely, discoordinated, unbalanced. That is the reflective consciousness. And when you balance up, the effects that you identify as the reflective consciousness recedes. It doesn't all of a sudden disappears. It recedes slowly. And in the end, I think when it almost disappeared, you realize it's just problems in thinking that caused it. It was never there in the first case. But it's good to think in this level that it has some sort of existence to it, or truth. So this is preceded, Benjamin Libet's ideas are preceded with William James's in the Principles of Psychology already in 1890, where he debunks the notion of a mysterious will that oversees actions. In most cases, James asserts actions simply flow out of associations of thought. This conception in James's work was a challenge to the commonly held belief that our actions issue from our conscious will, that we choose to do things and that we have done what we have done we have chosen to do. The vast majority of our actions, James argues, are not chosen at all, in the sense that we usually mean by issue upon the mere thought of it. Action or motor action is linked with thought, and since our thoughts follow associational paths, the action which flows from the thought is dictated strictly by causal laws. James, borrowing the term from earlier writers, called this phenomena ideomotor action. So the will, so to speak, is in the acting. It's not situated somewhere in a transcendent world. It is in how we move, and different levels of want or intention are different patterns of movement. And movement contain all the information, so to speak, or knowledge and intention, force. And that's why two people never have the same level of will and intention in doing something. That always varies. Whereas the reflective consciousness, classical physics makes some sort of equivalent that everybody can will an action at the same level. It's as easy for everyone to do it because actions are just there and you just have to think them and they pop out somehow. You see here, it's very similar to what we mentioned before, that actions are just there for a pick in some transcendental world. Just think of them and then you can perform them. It's nonsensical idea from the beginning, of course, but it's a priori very hard to point those things out, and William James did an excellent work. And of course this idea of actions being in some transcendental world just for our picking by thinking them makes these actions, when they actually are performed, more mechanical. And I think we try to imitate general sense of an action. We try to be what we think it is. Copy other people or something like that. They're not going to be apt for the purpose these actions. And actually we are controlled by imitating others. The generalized action out in the transcendental actually translates into we being parrots of other people's way of moving. Of course established when we were much younger. They already become a part of our reflective consciousness, but not our true self that actually make the decisions. But you see, this is also, the second aspect of this is also, of course, the parting of the original verb in Greek antiquity, pre-antiquity almost, when the verb was dissected into become object and subject, and these new verbs that were amputated, defunct, and objects that stole a little of the energy from the former verbs. And in the same way here you see action get mechanized. It gets something abstracted. And when we say abstract or transcendental, it could also be seen as we're not in control of it. We're distant to it. We don't feel it, we don't sense it, like we today not sense our body so much. Obviously, once again, the move from the body to the head, as Richard E. Lynn so aptly describes. I think that's well enough for a start with the idea of motor action. I have a headache building, it takes a lot of thinking, but I bid you a very nice evening. Thank you very much for the introduction. Cheers.